Hey friends, so in this video I want to talk about Matthew chapter 21 verses 1 through 11, which is the gospel reading for the sixth Sunday of Lent, or Palm Sunday, in year A of the lectionary. And before we dive into the text of Matthew specifically, I just want to mention that I'm going to try and keep this video a little bit shorter because I've already made a video on Luke 19:28 to 40 over here for Palm Sunday last year in year C of the lectionary. Luke 19 was the lectionary reading that Sunday, and I already did a very long video on that one. And so I don't want to repeat all of the same things from that video in talking about Matthew. Instead, I just kind of direct you to that video, and I'll try and link those videos together so that you can find it easily. And I've got the link down here as well in the document that I'll post in the Canvas course that this is for. Um, so I think my take on these passages, you can see I've got the three parallel passages here in Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 19. I think the main point of these passages are largely the same. And in fact, I've put that in this big box down here, that in one way or another, Matthew, Mark, and Luke each proclaim in their own way that Jesus was welcomed into Jerusalem as prophet, Lord, and King. And that's really, I think, the emphasis of this passage, right? This is, of course, what we celebrate on Palm Sunday is, we often talk about this as Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, right? So he's coming into Jerusalem and he is being welcomed by the crowd as prophet, Lord, and King. Of course, if you keep reading in the Gospels, you know that this welcome immediately is followed by significant controversy with the religious leaders that ultimately leads to Jesus' death. And in fact, I strongly encourage you to kind of continue to read in each of the Gospels after this, because while this particular passage, like just this set of verses for this Sunday, is actually really similar, I am going to talk about some of the differences you see I've highlighted here, but really these passages are quite similar between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three synoptic gospels. But after this passage, each of the three tells a lot of the same stories, but they tend to put them in a different order, and I think that order is actually significant. I'm not going to go into that in this video in hopes of not having it be too long, but I'd encourage you to keep reading and notice what's sort of particular to Matthew. Since we are in Matthew this year in the lectionary, notice what's particular to Matthew as compared to Mark and Luke. Perhaps especially notice how Matthew differs from Mark, since, as I talked about in the synoptic video, that the presumption among scholars is typically that Matthew had Mark in front of him when he's writing his gospel. And so that means that in the ways that Matthew is differing from Mark, that's probably an intentional choice on Matthew's part. And so then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, so then why is Matthew making those changes, right? Okay, but I'm not going to do all that in this video. I just encourage you to keep reading on your own to get a sense of this, especially as this passage now ushers us into Holy Week. And of course, for me, and I'll kind of give away the ending here, that for me, the real tension of Palm Sunday is welcoming Jesus as the kind of king he actually is, rather than the kind of king we want him to be. And that's precisely because of this tension that on Palm Sunday we're welcoming him as prophet, Lord, and King, when by Friday of the same week he's going to be crucified, right? For me, that's the irony of Palm Sunday. That's, in my mind, that's what Palm Sunday is largely about. Is that these same crowds that are welcoming him as prophet, Lord, and King on this day, by the end of the week, they're the same crowds that are shouting, "Crucify him!" Right? Um, and so for me, that's the real tension here. Is, yeah, we want to welcome Jesus as King, as long as we think he's going to be the kind of king we expect him to be. But when we find out that he's not maybe bringing the sort of typical kind of kingdom or rescue that we expect, then our shouts quickly turn to crucify him, right? And I think that uh, in many ways, this really gets to the heart of the gospel, is that we have to welcome Jesus and his cross-shaped kingdom, right? We have to welcome him for the kind of king that he is and the kind of kingdom that he intends to bring, not the kind of kingdom that we want him to bring that just favors us and those like us, right? So I'm kind of giving away the lead here, but I think that is ultimately, typically when I preach or teach on Palm Sunday, that's what I'm going to emphasize, and so that's the big picture here. And so I do want to notice some of the differences, but I don't want those differences to detract from. I think that is the big picture that each of these three passages share, even with the small differences in the way that they tell the story. That clearly Matthew, Mark, and Luke all are presenting Jesus as being welcomed by the crowds in Jerusalem as a significant figure, as a prophet, as we'll see, and also as Lord and King. But the irony is that then Jesus will enter into all this controversy while he's in Jerusalem, and ultimately that leads to his death. So I just keep that big picture in mind even as we go through this. All right, so having said that, let's just read through the Matthew passage here, and you can see I've highlighted where things are similar or different. Well, I've left unhighlighted what is basically the same and highlighted the differences. So when they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage, and you'll see that Mark and Luke both add, and also Bethany. At the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her." And Matthew's actually the only one who says a donkey as well as the colt, whereas Mark and Luke just have the colt. I don't know that there's any enormous significance to that, but just noting it there. If anyone, untie them and bring them to me. Verse 3, if anyone says anything to you, just say this: the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately. So then I'm going to talk more about that yellow, what's in the next quotation here in just a second. I do just quickly want to note that in the video on Luke, I noted that there's a lot of emphasis on Jesus' lordship because the title Kurios is repeated several times throughout the story. Because Matthew doesn't sort of repeat the story, like Matthew's Jesus says this is what's going to happen, and then in verse 6 the disciples went and did it, and he just says so it happened. Whereas Mark and Luke both sort of tell it twice, right? Jesus says this is what's going to happen, and then they tell us and this is what happened. And I think in Luke, that gives Luke the opportunity to emphasize Jesus' lordship, right? Because there's this repetition of Lord. Just say the Lord needs it. And their owners asked, which is the same word, kurioi, it's the plural. And then the Lord needs it again. And so it gives Luke this opportunity to emphasize Jesus' lordship in the story that Matthew leaves out. But what Matthew does that Mark and Luke do not do is specifically have this quote from Zechariah 9:9. And I'm not going to go into that a ton because I actually talked about that a lot in the video on Luke. But what you'll notice is that Luke doesn't actually quote Zechariah, right? Matthew does. Matthew says, "This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Um, Luke doesn't quote that. It's just assumed that that's in the background because Jesus is doing what Zechariah 9:9 says. So I talked a lot about that in that video, and so I would just point you to that video on Luke 19 to consider the significance of this quotation from Zechariah. What I do want to say in this video is that I do think it is representative of Matthew's gospel that Matthew actually adds the quote from Zechariah. And of course, you see Mark doesn't have it either. And so if Matthew is writing with Mark in front of him, this is an intentional change on Matthew's part. That Matthew's like, hey, clearly Mark is alluding to Zechariah 9:9. Why don't we just make that explicit? And I just want to note that this formula in verse 4, this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Matthew says that over and over and over again throughout his gospel in a way that Mark and Luke do not, right? Mark and Luke will certainly quote the Old Testament, will allude to prophecy, sometimes allude to Jesus being the fulfillment of prophecy, but this specific formula, this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, is one that Matthew uses repeatedly. And so it is a theme of his gospel that Jesus is the fulfillment of what had of prophecy. And I think I mentioned in another video once that actually I love the way that I love the way that the First Nations translation of the New Testament takes this formula, because it says something like, "This happened to bring to full meaning what had been spoken through the prophet." And I like that because I think it at least indicates for me that it's not just that it's a sort of prophetic checklist, right? That if you just read all the prophets, you get a checklist of what the Messiah is supposed to be, and Jesus checks that off. Because actually, what most people expected of the Messiah in first century, Jesus doesn't check that off, right? He doesn't fulfill the prophetic checklist in a lot of ways. In fact, in a lot of ways, he challenges it, right? He does all these things that he fulfills all these scriptures that were not seen as messianic, like the suffering servant passages of Isaiah 52 and 53. So I sort of like that First Nations translation of like, oh, it's not just that oh, here's the prophecy and he's checking it off. It's he brought it to its full meaning. Jesus sort of gives it even more meaning than the original prophet might have anticipated, right? And I think that actually comes closer to the ways that the Gospels represent Jesus fulfilling prophecy. Not that it's just like, oh, this was said and he did it, because again, in a lot of cases, Jesus didn't fulfill those specific prophecies. He fulfilled different ones. But it's when you read those prophecies through the person of Jesus, now they have new meaning, right? They've those prophecies have been brought to a fuller meaning by reading them through the lens of the person of Jesus. And I would just encourage anybody to sort of read these prophetic quotations in the gospel with that kind of mindset. I think that's actually more helpful. So in any case, uh, Matthew quotes this specifically, and that's indicative of his gospel. And it does just make a subtle shift. It's not a huge deal, but a subtle shift between what Mark and Luke are doing, in the sense that because Mark and Luke, like I said, they sort of repeat the story in the sense that Jesus says, this is what's going to happen. And then they each tell us, and then this is what happened. That both in Mark and Luke shows Jesus as a prophet himself, right? Because he says, this is what's going to happen, and then it happens. So it gives Jesus himself this prophetic character, which I think Matthew also wants to give Jesus that prophetic character. But then what Matthew is really emphasizing that Mark and Luke are not is not just that Jesus himself is a prophet. Matthew does say that. We'll get to that down here. Uh, so it's not that Matthew's not saying that, but in addition to that, Matthew also wants to say not only is he a prophet, but he himself is also a fulfillment of prophecy. Or to actually, I'd say what he's doing is he's making that more clear and more explicit. Because I actually think Mark and Luke are doing that too. Because again, they're both having Jesus fulfill this prophecy of Zechariah 9:9 by having him go ride on this colt, right? Uh, but Matthew wants to make it explicit. He wants to make sure you don't miss it. Whereas Mark and Luke may be a little more subtle, like, oh, maybe you'll pick up on this illusion, maybe you won't. But Matthew wants to make sure you don't miss that Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy of Zechariah. And that is really sort of indicative of Matthew's gospel, that this is the kind of thing Matthew does all the time, that he's sort of taking the things that Mark maybe leaves implied, and Matthew wants to make them more explicit and really emphasize that Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy. Uh, so, as I said, if you continue in Matthew, the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. And so you don't get the same repetition of the story in 6 and 7 of Matthew as you do in these verses in Mark and Luke, where it actually says that they did all the things that Jesus said would happen. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And you can see that all three synoptic gospels include some variation of this quote that comes from Psalm 118, which is, of course, our psalm for Palm Sunday, as well from the lectionary, very fittingly. Um, Again, I talk a lot about Psalm 118 in the video on Luke, so I'm not going to go into that again here, but I'd encourage you to take a look at that video. But it is a fitting psalm because the psalm itself has this sort of uh, almost a parade type procession in its very writing, and so it's appropriate that this is what's being quoted as Jesus is entering into Jerusalem in his own sort of triumphal procession, so to speak. But again, more about that in the Luke video, so I'm not going to repeat all that here, but I encourage you to check that out. So then finally, when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." So you see that Matthew still has this emphasis on the fact that Jesus himself is a prophet, as well as fulfilling prophecy. I'll just quickly note the differences here. In Mark, this is one of my favorite parts of Mark's gospel because Jesus entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, looked around at everything, and it was already late, and so he went out to Bethany with the 12. So in Mark, Jesus has this climactic moment. He's come to the temple, and everyone's like, "Ooh, what's going to happen? What's he going to do?" He looks around and he leaves, right? But Mark is sort of setting up the story so that he can come back the next day, and uh, he sees the fig tree that doesn't bear any fruit, and he curses it, and then he goes into the temple and turns over the tables of the money changers. And then the next day they come and see that the fig tree that Jesus cursed the previous day was withered. And so you've got this story sandwich in Mark where the fig tree is a symbol for the temple, right? Just as Jesus came to the fig tree and didn't find any fruit on it and he cursed it, so also he came to the temple, didn't find it bearing the fruit that it was supposed to be bearing, and he cursed it, right? Um, Matthew shuffles those stories around a little bit. They're still there, but it doesn't have the same sandwich structure. So I said I wasn't going to get into all that, but sometimes I can't help myself. You see that in Luke, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." And he answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." And so a little bit of a difference in each of the way these stories ends in the Gospels, and as I mentioned before, then a little bit different in how they proceed from that point on. I won't go into that in any more depth because I don't want to make this video any longer. So, but just to recap, as I said, for me, the main point here is that the crowds are welcoming Jesus as prophet, Lord, King. They're shouting, "Hosanna, deliver us. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Right? So they are welcoming him as king. But of course, it won't be very long before they're not welcoming him at all, but instead want to crucify him. And so that is the tension that I'm almost always going to highlight in one way or another on Palm Sunday. If you want to sort of really capture the flavor of Matthew in particular in this year of the lectionary, as opposed to what we hear from Mark and Luke in the other years of the lectionary, I think the sort of just subtle shift, the slight emphasis for Matthew is that he is especially concerned to show that Jesus fulfills prophecy as well as being a prophet himself. And so I think you can bring special attention to that in the way that Jesus fulfilling this prophecy from Zechariah 9:9. Uh, so, uh, may you have a blessed Palm Sunday as you preach from the Gospel of Matthew this week or study the Gospel of Matthew together with those in your congregation.